Last time we looked at the early ministry of Jesus, his day of ministering at Capernaum. We saw that the ministry of Jesus was met with overwhelming approval by the townsfolk in Capernaum and the people of the surrounding regions of Galilee. This session will continue with that approval from the common people, but there will be an added component. Any person who draws great crowds will eventually come to the notice of the authorities of the day. The political authorities, especially in Palestine, would be concerned about one who heals, exercises, draws great crowds, and claims to be Messiah, fearing their own positions. Mark 2:1 to 3:6, the material that concerns us in this session, introduces us to just such a series of conflicts in a series of 5 narratives culminating in the decision of the religious authorities, quote, how they might destroy him. This section will sow the seeds that will ultimately lead to the death and resurrection. The 5 controversy stories are the cure of the paralytic at Capernaum, the Call of Levi, the controversy over fasting, the plucking or picking of grain on the Sabbath, and the cure of the man with the withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Each of these units, Jesus comes into controversy with the leaders of Judaism, the scribes or the Pharisees. And in each of them, the leaders object to what Jesus is doing, while the general population laud his work. The first story begins after several days. Seemingly a short time has passed since the cure of the leper. Jesus returns to Capernaum from his ministry in Greater Galilee. Capernaum by this time has come to be designated as his home. Jesus' base for the ministry is now at Capernaum, more than likely at the home of Peter and Andrew. The response of the people in Capernaum is no different to the rest of the people in Galilee. When word is out that Jesus is there, they swarm the house, making it impossible to even approach the door. There are so many seeking to hear his word and seeking to be cured. Therefore, Jesus began to preach the word to them. But it is not long before the focus shifts from Jesus and his preaching to a paralytic who is being brought toward the house by 4 men. We have in this text on the paralytic another Markan sandwich. The exterior, the bread, is the story of the cure of the paralytic. The interior, or the meat, is a controversy between the scribes and Jesus over the forgiveness of sins. It is clear that the paralytic wants to get to Jesus for a cure, but it's impossible due to the sheer mass of the crowd. But the crowd will not deter them from their task. If they can't get to Jesus through the door, there are other ways to get to Jesus. In this case, they go up to the roof and remove the tiles. Literally, they unroof the roof over where Jesus was and lower the paralytic on his mat right in front of Jesus. Jesus observes their determination and their faith that underlies it, and reacts in a twofold manner. Verse 2:5 forms a literary seam with verse 2:11 through the words, he said to the paralytic. What Jesus says to the paralytic in 2:5 and 2:11 form the twofold reaction and the Markan sandwich. The first statement of Jesus to the paralytic is, your sins are forgiven. In the context of the narrative, that's somewhat startling as a reaction. Granted, there was thought to be a connection between sin and sickness, and so the paralysis could be the result of sin, and thus the forgiveness of sin a prelude to curing the paralysis. But there's nothing to prepare us for that. The statement of forgiveness comes out of the blue. In light of what has proceeded, we would expect Jesus to say, arise and walk, curing the paralytic. But this is something totally new. Not only does Jesus preach with authority, cure illnesses, expel demons, he also forgives sins, a prerogative reserved to God alone. Among the onlookers are members of a group not mentioned in the gospel to this point, the scribes. They're members of official Judaism who have a very special interest in the interpretation of the law. Their reaction to this startling statement is to ponder it in their hearts. Mark says they're murmuring in their hearts. They question Jesus' action and statement. This is a picture of a roof of a typical first century house. Note the wooden cross hatching, which would have been covered with straw. It would be relatively easy to remove the straw and the necessary wooden beams to allow the mat on which the paralytic was lying to be lowered down. I'm sure that it was quite a sight for those sitting and listening to Jesus to look up and see this paralytic being lowered. The scribes think, "What is this man doing? Why does he speak in this manner? He is blaspheming." In forgiving sins, Jesus, whom the scribes see as an ordinary human being, is taking onto himself a prerogative that belongs to God, and to God alone. Thus, he's making himself equal to God, which they consider blasphemy. They're not aware of what the reader of the gospel is slowly being informed, that in reality, Jesus is God. Then they express their belief. Who but the one God can forgive sins? They feel that Jesus has gone too far, not recognizing that he is forgiving sins as an agent of God's forgiveness. Jesus is not oblivious to their objections. He realizes that they are questioning his motives and asks why they do so. This is yet another manifestation of his divinity, since the Old Testament tells us that God knows the hearts and minds of humans in 1 Samuel 16:7. Jesus then poses his own question to the unbelieving scribes. Which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or "Arise, take up your pallet and walk"? In the current situation, it would be easier to say your sins are forgiven because the onlookers have no way of knowing whether it happens or not. On the other hand, "Arise and walk" has the possibility of verification. Either the man will walk and Jesus' power is visible, or he won't. But in typical style, Jesus is going to say both. The inserted unit on forgiveness ends with a climactic, solemn statement, "that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." The proof of the first, the forgiveness of sins, is the second, the cure of the paralysis. He says, "I say to you, arise, take up your pallet and go home." The scribes are silenced by Jesus' words and his actions. The paralytic is forgiven and walks. So the release from paralysis is a restoration of the paralytic's life. The paralytic does as Jesus commanded. He rose up, picked up his mat, and went away. The reaction of the onlookers is astonishment and praise of God. They don't see Jesus as a blasphemer, but rather as an agent of God. Their praise stands counter to the scribes' charge of blasphemy. The scribes see Jesus as an impostor. The people see God as present in his actions. The opening verse of the gospel announced that Jesus was the Son of God. The voice from heaven at the baptism declared Jesus as his Son. Here Jesus acts in that role of Son, taking on himself prerogatives that are strictly God's. After curing the paralytic, Jesus returns to the area along the Sea of Galilee. Last time he was there, he invited 4 fishermen to be his disciples. Now he encounters another man, Levi, the son of Alphaeus, to whom he gives an invitation to follow. The crowd seems to be following wherever Jesus goes, and he indulges their desires by teaching them. It is in the course of this teaching that he spots Levi, who was sitting at his tax office. Levi was a tax collector. Now, tax collectors were a rather despised group in the first century, in Palestine particularly, because they had a reputation for cheating the people, and through their tax collection position, growing rich themselves. Now, in a society where money was scarce to start with, you can see how this would cause people to despise tax collectors. Jesus gives him the invitation, "Follow me." In other words, be my disciple. This is the same invitation issued to Peter, Andrew, James, and John in chapter 1. Levi's response is just as immediate as theirs. He arose and followed. The word for arise or arose on histemi is one of the words that will be used to designate the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, in modern Greek, the resurrection is known as the anastasis. So this response to the call of Jesus will cause a total turning around in Levi's life. It will be like a resurrection. The scene quickly shifts from the shores of the Sea of Galilee to the house of Levi, where there is a gathering of Levi's cohorts designated as tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus' disciples. Jesus is reclining at table with the other guests. The implication is that many of the tax collectors and sinners were followers of Jesus. Word gets to the officials of Judaism, the scribes and the Pharisees, that Jesus and his group are sharing table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners, an act that was totally prohibited in the eyes of the authorities because it acknowledged the actions of the tax collectors and the sinners. The scribes ask Jesus' disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Note that the tense of the verb is present, which indicates that this is not an isolated incident, but rather a customary action. Jesus overhears and responds with a little proverb. The healthy have no need of a doctor, but the sick do. He then applies that proverb to his mission. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. The application then becomes the answer to the question posed by the scribes. So making the application, Jesus is the doctor. The Pharisees would be those who are healthy, the righteous. They're supposed to have a good relationship with God following the law. The tax collectors and the sinners are the sick, those who are not following the law. Thus, as we have seen in the preceding text, Jesus now mediates not only healing, the curing of illness, but also forgiveness. He heals sinners. No, this is not a picture of some people resting in the hot sun. It shows the way people of the first century reclined for a meal. They were in long couches on which the guests would sit, as the two gentlemen here in the picture are doing. They would rest their arms on an armrest and partake of the meal. Just imagine a table with scrumptious food in front of the two diners, and you get some picture of the scene with Jesus. The third controversy concerns fasting. Mark notes that two other major groups of disciples, the disciples of the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist, were accustomed to fast. Note again that the tense suggests that this fasting is customary rather than an isolated action. So the question is asked regarding the disciples of Jesus. Why don't they follow the same custom and fast? Jesus' response is again to draw their attention to a very common occurrence in their lives, the wedding reception. He says, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is still with them? As long as the bridegroom is with them, they cannot fast. Now this seems a very peculiar answer to the question. We're not at a wedding, and there is no bridegroom. Or is there? If we're looking for a literal wedding, then that is the case. But what if the wedding is a symbol? What if Jesus himself is the bridegroom and the wedding is his ministry? Then the wedding guests, the disciples, would act as any guest at a wedding and enjoy themselves eating and drinking and not fasting. That such is the meaning is confirmed with the next words out of Jesus' mouth. But, days are coming. The Greek particle de is used to show a totally different set of circumstances. On the one hand, the bridegroom is present. But, on the other hand, days are coming, when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then the disciples will fast. What days are those? This is the first veiled reference to what will ultimately be the end of the gospel. The bridegroom, Jesus, will be taken in the passion and the crucifixion. That will cause great sadness among the disciples, but he will conquer in the resurrection. So we are not talking literally about weddings, but rather, if I may use the term, metaphorically. The wedding is Jesus' ministry, and the bridegroom is Jesus. Jesus then adds two illustrative sayings to his example, one about cloth and one about wineskins, in what I call a Greek student's nightmare, simply because of the unusual vocabulary and grammar. Jesus reminds the people that no one sews unshrunken cloth on an old cloak. So the example is a hole or a tear in your coat. Now, we have to be familiar with the custom of the first century here. All cloth used was to be pre-shrunk. Now, that may or may not make sense to us in our polyester world. But if you ever bought a 100% cotton shirt or blouse and were not careful with it in the washer and the dryer, it comes out a few sizes smaller and is good for your younger brother or sister, but not you. It has shrunk. Now, let's take that back to the first century. You have a hole in your cloak, and you put a piece of unshrunken cloth on it, and then it gets wet in the rain, or you wash your cloak. The unshrunken cloth shrinks, and what happens to the hole? It gets bigger, because the cloth tears away, and the final situation is much worse than the original. So what do? Get pre-shrunken cloth, which I believe is not easy in that time, or you buy yourself a new cloak. So what is Jesus saying with this cloth metaphor? The cloak is Judaism, which needs patching. Jesus' message is not that appropriate patch. If you think so, your situation will become much worse. Rather, Jesus' message demands a total change of mindset. That is very similar to what was being asked at the beginning of the gospel. Repent, that is, change one's mind or heart. Jesus is not here to heal the ills of Judaism. This example links easily to the following. The second example concerns wineskins. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Why is that so? New wine has a tendency to expand, while old wineskins are brittle and don't expand very well. You can imagine the result. New wine starts expanding, and the skin has to give. The wine will expand no matter what, and suddenly the skin will burst, causing loss of both the wine and the skin. So Jesus is explicit here. New wine, naos, needs to be put into new wineskins, kainos. There's a play on words here. Two words for new are used. The first word, naos, which modifies wine, refers to new in terms of time, so the latest vintage. The second word used for new modifying wineskin is kainos, which refers to quality, that is, fresh quality or good wineskins. Again, the new wine is Jesus' teaching. The old wineskins are the ways of Judaism. The two are not compatible. Jesus' teaching needs a totally new container. There's that metanoia again. So the answer to the original question is that the disciples do not fast because the whole notion of fasting needs to be looked at in light of the Jesus experience. One final note. This picture gives you an idea of what a wineskin is that we're talking about. Losing much of the wine, that much wine particularly, would be quite a tragedy, don't you think? The fourth controversy concerns the disciples of Jesus working on the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath. As is common when walking through any grain field, they find it necessary to cut or pick some of the grain that to make a path. The Pharisees, wherever they came from, object to the disciples' actions, saying they're unlawful. The Pharisees are interpreting the disciples picking grain as reaping, which indeed is unlawful on the Sabbath. Jesus' response is to show how this is a perfect example of what he meant in the two preceding examples on coats and wineskins. He recalls the Old Testament for the Pharisees, in particular the text of 1 Samuel 21, 1-6, concerning David and his troops at the sanctuary of God. David is returning from battle. He and his troops are hungry. They ask Abiathar, the high priest, for some bread. All that is available is the bread of offering reserved to the priests. Nevertheless, realizing their situation, he allows them to eat it. In essence, Mark is noting that David was allowed to do what was contrary to the law for a good reason. How much more should not Jesus do the same for a good reason? In David's case, the necessity of food surpassed the legal demands. Jesus then solemnly states his position. The Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. Note the parallel structure. People are not to be slaves of the Sabbath. This principle may be taken by some as giving license to do whatever they want on the Sabbath, or even with regards to the law in general. But that isn't the case. Belief in the good news of God's love for us is the ground of all we do, as we have seen from the beginning of the gospel. And that belief helps how we work out the law. The final statement of Jesus in this controversy is a summation of what has proceeded, with the result that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. First, we have the introduction of a new title to the gospel, Son of Man. It's derived from the Old Testament books of Ezekiel and Daniel, and the intertestamental book of Enoch. It is also Jesus' favorite title to refer to himself. That is, you can substitute I for many of Jesus' statements using Son of Man. So we can then rephrase the statement here as I am Lord even of the Sabbath. Now that's quite a statement. Jesus here places himself above the law. Join that to the statements on forgiveness in the first controversy, and we're beginning to get a pretty good picture of whom Mark conceives Jesus to be. He's no ordinary human being. He is much more than that. The final scene in this section is climactic. Once again, we find Jesus in a synagogue on the Sabbath. Immediately, Mark tells us that in the synagogue was a man with a withered hand. The attention of those gathered in the synagogue is on Jesus. However, this time it's not to listen to his teaching, but to see what he would do for the man. Would he heal him or not? According to Jewish law, healing was not counted among the actions permitted on the Sabbath. The text goes on to note that the purpose of their watching Jesus was to bring a charge against him or accuse him of breaking the law. Seemingly, the people in the synagogue have been influenced by the authorities. They're seeking to charge Jesus, not amazed at his teaching and actions. Jesus, despite their intent, attacks the problem head-on, commanding the man to arise into the middle of the synagogue. Again, the Greek is telling. The word for arise is egero, which, as I have mentioned before, is one of the words mentioned to refer to the resurrection. So Mark intends that we will have a restoration of life in Jesus' actions for the man in this text. With the man in full view, Jesus then addresses a question to his opponents. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? Without ever hearing a word from the congregation, Jesus knows their intention and he calls them on it. He is for all practical purposes asking, what does the law say about this situation? In the dichotomy of saving life versus destroying life, we see yet another connection to the resurrection. Is it permitted for Jesus to give this man a new life? Further, the argument becomes, if it is permitted to save a life on the Sabbath, then by analogy, a lesser action such as restoration of health would also be permitted. The congregation remains silent. Jesus is angered by their implications, and he turns an eye to the entire congregation with anger in his eyes. He is grieved at their hardness of heart. In the Hebrew understanding of the human being, the heart is the center of intellectual activity. In our understanding of the human being, the heart is the center of emotion. So hardness of heart can be an inability to act with sufficient thought or feeling. The people in the synagogue are blinded by their unswerving desire to follow the law. As a result, they're not thinking, nor have they any feeling for this man. Jesus shows, however, that he is both thinking and has feeling for the man, and that both have a place on the Sabbath. He commands the man to stretch out his hand. The man does, and it is restored. Jesus has permitted the man a renewed life, which is the sensible and caring thing to do. Thus, Jesus has challenged the people in the synagogue to reevaluate their thinking regarding the law and its rigid observance. The response of those in the synagogue is immediate. They, identified now as the Pharisees, leave the synagogue and head to another authority party, the Herodians, that is, those aristocrats who were pro-King Herod Antipas. Forming an alliance, they vow to devise a plan on how to destroy Jesus. It's ironic that the plan that will be formulated as a result of this alliance will lead to the destruction of Jesus' life. It seems that the Pharisaic members of the congregation have had an answer to Jesus' question all along, and it is not a rigid interpretation of the law. The decision sets in motion a series of events that will come to a head when Jesus gets to Jerusalem toward the end of the gospel. In the minds of the Pharisees and the Herodians, they will seem to have accomplished their goal. But Jesus will not be destroyed. He will rise on the third day, conquering death and all the plots and plans of his opponents. Nevertheless, Jesus' popularity continues to grow, and so does the opposition. In our next session, we shall see yet another expansion of the ministry, coupled with a charge that in his ministry he's not from God, but rather in collusion with the devil.